Hi everyone, it's TW. Thank you for joining us for our special holiday episode of Grim Harvest Podcast. As always, a big thank you to our patrons Chris, David, Sarah, Jim, Mary, and Anonymous for making this show happen. We started this podcast without the aid of sponsorships or investor money of any kind, so the direct support of our audience really makes a difference. If you become a patron, you'll have early access to every episode, plus merchandise and exclusive content that can only be found on the Grim Harvest Patreon account. Speaking of merchandise, the first wave of t-shirts and stickers are being shipped, and an adaptation of one of my longer works is currently in development as a Patreon exclusive. If you'd like to become a patron, go to patreon.com/grimharvest. That's patreon.com/grimharvest.
This is the Grim Harvest Podcast, Farm Fresh Horror, right to your door.
Today's tale of holiday dread is called Elf on the Shelf, written by Vincent Vena Cava and narrated by David Ault.
Peter Tubin is going insane. At least that's a possibility he's seriously considering. It's the elf sitting on the edge of his kitchen counter, snug between his koi rig and his microwave. That is the reason why he's contemplating his mental well-being. It wears green and white stockings and a pair of red boots that curl up at the toes with little brass bells dangling off the ends of them. Atop its head sits an oversized Phrygian cap, the end of which sags impotently over its right shoulder. It has rosy cheeks, a pair of big blue eyes, a pointy nose, and from ear to ear it sports a wide, tight-lipped grin. It's not a real elf, mind you, not in the sense that it's made of flesh and blood. It doesn't move, or sing, or dance. It doesn't live in the North Pole, and it certainly doesn't build toys for all the good little Gentile boys and girls of the world. No, this elf is 50% wool, 30% polyester, 20% some other synthetic fiber that Peter can't pronounce, and its body is filled with heavy plastic beads that give it weight. Peter had purchased it on a whim only a couple of hours earlier after stopping into a discount retail store on his way back from Pappy's Coffee. He had hoped it would help sprinkle a little Christmas cheer around his West Hollywood apartment. Elf on the Shelf, the package had read. Your very own Christmas time pal. And so he brought it home, opened the box, placed the silly-looking thing on the edge of his bookshelf, and forced himself to smile. Now, 2 hours later, the elf is sitting on the kitchen counter, and Peter is sure he hadn't moved it. How had it managed to navigate itself from one end of his place to the other? Had someone broken into his apartment and rearranged his stuff while he was busy eating ice cream and looking at stupid cat gifs on his phone in the bedroom? If so, had this mystery intruder stolen anything on their way out? As far as Peter can tell, nothing appears to be missing. As a matter of fact, the only thing that seems out of place is the little elf grinning vapidly at him from his kitchenette's faux granite countertop. Peter snatches the elf by its round, bulbous head, then makes his way towards the front door. Loose, creaky floorboards sing nervously beneath his feet, each step accompanied by tragic squeals and squeaks, each step sounding yet another note of some dissonant Yuletide carol. There is only one door in and out of his apartment, and it's locked, just as he left it. If someone had been inside his place, then he would have needed to phase through the door to get out. Peter unfastens the lock, cracks the door, and peers outside, but finds no suspects loitering nearby, not a pilferer or prankster or prowler in sight. He sits the elf on the edge of his coffee table, takes a few steps towards the bedroom, and then just to be sure whirls around as fast as he can, only to find the pint-sized imp hasn't budged an inch in the 4 seconds or so since he positioned it in its new resting place. Of course it hasn't budged. It's an inanimate object, for Christ's sake, and inanimate objects don't just get up and walk across apartments when no one is looking. He must have moved the thing himself at some point when his mind was on autopilot. Sure, that makes sense. After all, he has been dealing with a lot of stress lately. Peter shakes off his manic little episode, then retreats into his bedroom so that he can go back to practicing his new favourite hobby of burying his loneliness into a pint of Rocky Road. This is the first year Peter will not be spending Christmas with his family back home in Mississippi. He would like to be with them, but knows he isn't welcome, not since coming out to his folks during Thanksgiving dinner. He had prepared himself for a bit of blowback from his staunch conservative family, but had not anticipated just how appalled they would be once they learnt he preferred the company of men to women. He figured any differences they had could be talked out, but his mother had cried when she heard the news, and his brother had threatened to pummel him. Then there was his sister, who was so afraid that Peter's gayness might be contagious, she declared he would never be allowed within sneezing distance of his nephew again. "Get out and don't come back," his father had shouted. So Peter boarded a flight back to Los Angeles that night and hasn't heard a peep from his family since. Not even Nana has bothered to call. If things had gone better, Peter would have told them that he had met the love of his life, a handsome young man named Alan, whom he had spent nearly every day with over the past 8 months. Alan was the first man, well, the first anybody really, that Peter had ever been intimate with. He was educated, well-to-do, and most important of all, Peter could finally be himself around someone. Thanksgiving had left him discouraged, but not broken. His family might come around eventually, and even if they didn't, at least he still had his boyfriend. But alas, life is cruel, and sometimes a little icy heartache can turn into a blizzard of misery. Peter received a text after his plane had landed in LA. Alan wanted to see other people. They were moving too fast for his liking, and at just 26, he wanted to explore his options. "I'm not ready to give you my heart," was how the message had ended. Every day since has been an exercise in solitude for poor Peter. Now he has no boyfriend, no family, not even a friend to phone, and with Christmas only 2 days away, he has nobody to spend the holiday with for the first time in his life. Peter wakes up screaming to a dark, starless sky outside his bedroom window, and for a moment it seems as though the heavens have vanished. The time on his phone reads 3 a.m. He needs to get some more sleep, but he isn't eager to return to his nightmares yet, so he props himself up instead, resting his back against the headboard of his bed. A yawn forces itself from his mouth as he lets his eyes wander around the room. It is here when he notices it, feet dangling off the end of his dresser, gazing at him through a pair of comically large glassy blue eyes. An arctic chill runs down Peter's spine at the sight of his late-night visitor. It isn't the moaning, chain-clad ghost of Jacob Marley, although in that moment he wishes it was. Peter reaches a trembling hand towards his bedside lamp. In a clumsy panic, he knocks over the pint of Rocky Road, and sticky brown goop dribbles down the end table and onto the carpet below. He curses under his breath while he fumbles with the lamp. After what feels like an eternity, he manages to find the switch, and a dim yellow glow pours into his bedroom. Peter stares hazy-eyed at the soupy chocolate puddle seeping into his rug, briefly wondering how in hell he's going to get the stain out, and then he remembers the abominable sense of dread that had just shocked him awake a few moments ago. He chances a glance to the dresser, hoping the shadows had just been playing tricks on him. It wouldn't be the first time. All too often when he was a kid, he'd awake in bed to find himself the victim of their puckish late-night hijinks. They'd dance and frolic across the walls, casting grotesque shapes in the darkness. They'd haunt his dreams, they'd rob him of sleep, and on more than one occasion their pranks had even caused him to soil his sheets. But those nasty shadows are gone now, the light has banished them away, and all that remains is the little elf sitting across the room, grinning at him in all its horrible holiday glory. There is no malice behind the painted-on smile that is terrorizing Peter's psyche. There is no anything, really. The elf's face hasn't changed since Peter first removed the thing from its flimsy cardboard packaging. Yet still, its grin disturbs him. The very sight of it is enough to numb his brain worse than any gas station icy ever could. He wrestles with the reality of what is going on while desperately trying to maintain his grip on sanity. Peter had chalked up the first incident to a slip of the mind, but twice now he has found the creepy thing somewhere it had no right to be. He had set the elf on the coffee table before going to bed. Of this he is certain. So how the hell is it currently sitting on his dresser? Sleepwalking. The idea barrels down on him like an avalanche. Peter once read in a psychology textbook that stress can be a trigger for sleepwalking. And if he remembers correctly, the condition isn't simply resigned to people who wander their houses like brain-dead zombies. During episodes, subjects suffering from the disorder have been documented to open doors, binge on food, and even rearrange the furniture in their homes. Could it be possible that the breakup with Alan has sparked an unconscious urge in Peter to deck the halls, even while he dozed? He knows the idea sounds shaky, but what's the alternative? That the elf is wandering around his place on its own whenever he isn't paying attention? He shudders at the thought, then decides it would be best if he stuck to the sleepwalking theory instead. Nonetheless, the fucking elf will have to go. The night is unfriendly at this hour, both quiet and cold. There isn't another soul in sight, not even a car rolling down the road in front of Peter's apartment building. By morning, the street will be bustling with commuters, and pedestrians will be crossing at every intersection, but for now, the rest of the world is hiding from him. A frigid wind blows through the air, and Peter hugs himself to fight it off. He is walking across the parking lot, elf in hand, towards a big black dumpster filled with dirty diapers, old magazines, and fruitcakes from Grandma that taste like sawdust. He doesn't want to be outside right now, freezing his ass off in his PJs, but he won't be able to sleep with the elf in his apartment, so he sucks it up and marches onward. The sooner he gets rid of it, the sooner he can go back to bed. Peter's thoughts drift off to Alan as he hurries along the asphalt. He is wishing they hadn't spent so much time together. Maybe if he had given himself more space while they were a couple, the breakup wouldn't have been so painful. But he had grown accustomed to falling asleep with his boyfriend's arm around his waist, had gotten used to waking up every morning to his face. Now that Alan is gone, Peter is beginning to realize how difficult adapting to life without him will be. Is Alan having trouble adapting too? Probably not. He hadn't even bothered to check on Peter since he kicked him to the curb like a dried-up Christmas tree. When Peter reaches the dumpster, he places the elf down gently on the closest pile of stinky garbage. He studies it curiously, half expecting the plushy little thing to spring to life like Frosty the Snowman and belt out a rendition of Santa Baby while doing a jig on top of a greasy pizza box. The musical number never comes through. The elf just sits and grins and stares, and after some time Peter realizes that no matter how hard his paranoia might be trying to will the absurd spectacle into reality, a singing dancing doll is one Christmas miracle that simply isn't going to happen. Relieved by this sudden moment of clarity, he closes the dumpster's lid and seals the elf away inside its trashy tomb. When he returns to bed, he sees the notification light on his phone is blinking. Someone has texted him, but he can't think of anyone who might be up at this time of night. Maybe the elf had sent the message from some discarded phone it found in the dumpster. "Don't leave me here, baby, it's cold outside." He laughs the notion off, but before his giggle even trails away, a second idea trickles into mind. Peter used to receive late-night texts from Alan on those rare evenings they weren't together. These texts almost always turned into sexual conversations, and almost always ended with Peter driving over to Alan's place for a little nocturnal necking. Is Alan looking for a booty call? Peter wonders what he'll do if this turns out to be the case. Part of him wants to lash out in disgust at the idea of being used for sex, but part of him burns desperately to have his old flame touch his body once more. Sure, it might be degrading, but it would be nice to feel needed, if only for one night. Peter opens his phone, head buzzing with possibilities, unsure of how he might respond to Alan's request. But once he sees the text, his excitement dwindles down to nothingness, and his heart shatters inside his chest like a cheap glass ornament. This is your service provider. You have 10% more data left on your phone. If you go over, you will be charged. Even cities the size of Los Angeles slow down on Christmas Eve. There's still traffic, of course, but Peter's commute to the gym takes nearly half the usual time, and when he gets there he finds that aside from a few geriatric gym rats and the handful of people who made it to spin class that day, he has the run of the place. He doesn't want to be there, but he doesn't think that sitting at home by himself is a healthy way to deal with his self-diagnosed depression, so he forces himself through the motions, pushing up dumbbells and pulling down levers, and running in place like a hamster on a wheel. He checks his phone throughout his workout, hoping that someone will acknowledge his existence. He isn't expecting much. Merry Christmas, or thinking of you, would be all the words of affirmation that he needs to get him through the day. But much to his dismay, nobody bothers to text. Not Mother, not Nana, and certainly not Alan. By the time he finishes his last exercise, he finds himself wishing he had passed the time that morning watching movies in bed. He cries in the shower at the gym. It's the first time he's been able to since the breakup, and once the waterworks start, there is no turning them off. Snot bubbles from his nose. His body shakes with despair. Tears cascade down his cheeks as hopeless sobs and groans burst free from his throat. He knows everyone in the locker room can hear him, but he's moved beyond the point of caring. A black, viscous sorrow has been swelling inside him for weeks, and now that it's finally spilling out, the naked old men within earshot of his woeful wails are the least of his concerns. Nobody makes eye contact with Peter after he towels himself off and heads to his locker. He's had enough of society today and wants nothing more than to be at home right now. His plan is to go back to his place just as soon as he gets dressed and spend the rest of the day eating ice cream on the couch. Peter's tears may have run dry, but he knows they'll come again. At least the next time his body decides to flush out all its excess grief, it can happen in the privacy of his own apartment. Peter opens his locker and reaches for his gym bag. He steps into his brief and slides them up over his rear, but before he can move on to his jeans, his muscles tense and his body freezes with fear. He stands petrified in his underwear, unable to move, staring hopelessly at the cracks in the locker room's tiled floor. Something hadn't been right about his locker, and his mind is only just starting to catch up to this fact. Nothing is missing. Even a cursory glance had been enough to tell Peter that all his clothes and belongings are present and accounted for. No, the problem is that he thinks he might have seen something else, in addition to his stuff, that had not been in his locker when he started his workout. He takes a long, hard swallow as he gathers the courage to look again. There is no way he had seen what he thinks he saw. That would be impossible. Perhaps it had just been an old stick of deodorant, one he hadn't noticed the first time he opened his locker. Or maybe he hadn't even seen anything at all. His paranoia has been working overtime since last night. A million other possibilities run through his head, but somewhere in the back of his mind he knows none of them are true. What he had seen in his locker could not be mistaken for anything else. Deodorant doesn't dangle its legs off of shelves. It doesn't wear green and white stockings. It doesn't have a pointy nose or big blue eyes. And it certainly doesn't smile at you like some tiny taxidermized Satan. Peter finally manages the nerve to break his paralysis long enough to lift his gaze back up to the shelf. The elf is back. There is no way to explain its presence this time. Peter knows it has no good reason to be there. Either someone is playing a hideous joke on him, or the freaky little thing is actually cursed. The latter is beginning to sound more probable by the second, but it's not like he bought the elf from some Chinatown antique shop run by an ancient relic of a man puffing from a pipe while mumbling cryptid warnings. The place he picked it up from was a franchised retail store not more than 2 blocks from his apartment that sold brand clothes at bargain prices and home decor that's almost always damaged. He had purchased a couple of pairs of socks from the same store, and to his knowledge they had yet to demonstrate the ability to teleport around wherever they pleased. The elf isn't helping his mental health. He won't be able to find an ounce of peace until it's out of his hair for good, but chucking it in the trash again is obviously out of the question. He could try burning it down to a pile of ashes, but he doesn't think the owners of his gym would appreciate him starting a small fire in the locker room, and he doesn't want to get arrested for arson. His best bet is to take it somewhere far away and leave it in a place he could be confident it won't come back from. He racks his brain, trying to think of where that place might be. It isn't long before an idea comes to him, and once it does, his eyes light up brighter than the Griswold house on Christmas. The Santa Monica Pier is a charming tourist trap featured regularly in television and movies. Visit any of the 300 identical souvenir shops in the area, and you can pick up a wonderful, shiny postcard displaying an image of the pier's famous Ferris wheel, towering over a bouquet of tattered, washed-out vendor umbrellas, like a lone sunflower standing among a meadow of wilting poppies. Walk along its famous boardwalk, and you'll find a myriad of family restaurants selling cut-rate, processed seafood, an arcade gallery with broken-down game machines, and tomorrow's music stars performing their latest hits in front of adoring crowds of 4 or 5. Peter is standing at the far end of the pier now, staring out across the vast openness that is the Pacific Ocean. He takes in a deep breath and can taste the salty tang of seaweed in the air. From his apartment, about 13 miles inland, a layer of car exhaust looms over the city like a hazy yellow ghost, but here, on the coast, the sky is blue and clear. In Peter's hand is a canvas shopping bag. In the bag is the elf and 6 or 7 good-sized rocks that he lifted from someone's drought-resistant front yard back in WeHo. He has not come to the pier to admire the fresh air or marvel at the Ferris wheel. He has done all that before. His plan is to drop the bag into the sea and let the elf sink down to the ocean's floor. If he had a boat, he might have sailed all the way out to open waters to dump the thing, but the water around the pier is plenty deep, and he thinks it should be enough to accomplish his task. A dozen feet to his right sit 2 old men on a bench. One is heavy-set with a moustache and salt and pepper hair. The other is thinner, clean-shaven with walnut-framed glasses and big white teeth that offer a strange contrast to his leathery, sun-beaten face. Their fishing poles lean precariously against the railing, the lines of which run down the edge of the wooden deck, disappearing into the ocean below. The old men pass a flask back and forth, paying little attention to their poles while gazing absent-mindedly out to sea. Peter checks the bag one more time just to be sure the elf hasn't pulled a Houdini and made a miraculous escape. To his relief, he finds it still right where he left it, half buried amongst a pile of smooth, polished stones, and gawking up at him through its enormous, empty eyes. Peter looks into its face, and as he does this, he reminisces about Alan again. He has decided that he's not just drowning the elf today, but the love he once had for his ex-boyfriend as well. He doesn't want to lie awake at night, wondering if Alan is missing him anymore. He wants to build scar tissue around his wounded heart. He wants it to become calloused and tough, so no one will be able to harm it again. Peter secures the sack shut with a double knot, then flings it over his shoulder like Saint Nick. He pauses for a moment and glances back at the old men to see if they might be watching, realizes they're paying even less attention to him than their fishing poles, and flings the bag off the pier. It lands in the murky blue water with an anticlimactic bloop, then sinks down, 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 disappearing into the sea. For a long time he stares at the water below, watching a brown rope of seaweed snake itself between the pier's great wooden pillars, not because he expects the elf to come bobbing back up to the surface, but because the whole ordeal has left him drained. Parting with the elf was easy, but drowning his feelings for Alan has taken more energy than he had anticipated. He wants to dive into the water like a lifeguard and rescue these feelings before they're gone forever, but he knows they must stay buried in the muck at the ocean's floor where they belong. Letting them breathe again might reopen the wound in his heart, and Peter understands he has only just begun to heal. Besides, things will get easier once January rolls around and everyone stops talking about love and togetherness. In the new year, he'll focus on himself and start fresh. He might even try keto or take up a new hobby. All he has to do now is figure out how to make it through Christmas. When Peter turns to leave, he catches a glimpse of the old men again and notices for the first time that they're holding hands. The moustached man takes a pull from his flask and passes it to his partner, who flashes his big white dentures before kissing him on the cheek. After he takes a sip, he rests his head on the moustached man's shoulder, and as he does this, Alan's face flashes to the forefront of Peter's mind. It appears that love may be more buoyant than Peter had hoped. He attempts to flood his head with other thoughts in a desperate attempt to keep it submerged, but to no avail. They're persistent, but he's not giving up yet. If his feelings won't stay buried at sea, then there's always other ways to drown them out. It's getting late, and Peter hasn't been home yet. After leaving the pier, he stopped off for a drink, and now, 8 Manhattans later, he's feeling plenty buzzed. He's sitting by himself in a dimly lit hovel of a bar. The phosphorescent glow of neon beer signs bleed across the walls, and tacky silver tinsel dangles carelessly from the ceiling. In the center of the room, a man and woman around Peter's age hold each other tight, shifting slowly from side to side, while the voice of Elvis Presley moans a lonely blue tune over the jukebox's speakers. They are wearing matching red sweaters flecked with heart-shaped snowflakes. As they sway, rhythm and inhibitions dulled by booze, the lovers allow their hands to explore each other's bodies, fondling and squeezing with zero concern for public decorum. Peter watches them from his shadowy corner. He envies how effortlessly they display their love, and he hates them for it. Just a few weeks ago, he thought he had something like that with Alan, but now he knows it wasn't real. There are a few others in the bar, but he's the only one drinking solo, and it seems that everyone in the world has someone to spend the holidays with aside from him. He tries to get up, stumbles backwards onto his stool, stands up successfully on his second attempt, then flags down the bartender. He's had enough to drink. With any luck, the cocktails will have him sleeping through the morning, and if that doesn't work, he has some pills in his medicine closet that should do the trick. A bartender wearing a striped tie adorned with happy, prancing reindeer brings the tab over. Peter hands him his credit card without looking at the bill, then returns his focus to the 2 turtle doves feeling each other up on the dance floor. His attention is only broken when he feels the buzz of his phone in his pocket. Peter pulls it free from his jeans, glances at the screen, and sees that he's received a text. His heart begins to beat inside his chest like a war drum at the sight of it. The message is from Alan. Alan is texting him now? After weeks of completely ignoring his existence? He's not ready for this, especially not after 8 cocktails. Against his better judgment, Peter opens up the message and reads it. It's short, but to the point, and this is what it says. You up? Before Peter even has a chance to respond, 2 more texts from Alan come through his phone. The first is a picture, but service in the bar is shoddy at best, and the image gets stuck in loading purgatory. A little wheel spins endlessly inside an empty grey box, letting Peter know that the pic will be available for viewing whenever his phone decides it's good and ready. He doesn't need to see the picture to know what it will be, though. A sexy selfie. Back when they were together, Alan had the habit of sending him naughty pics whenever he was fishing for company. After reading the next message, his suspicions are all but confirmed. Come sit by the tree with me, winky face. Peter watches the loading wheel as it continues to spin inside the empty grey window on his phone's screen, and he feels his blood beginning to boil. The man who so easily tossed him aside just a few weeks ago is trying to use him for sex on Christmas Eve. Is that all he is to him, some cheap holiday blow-up doll? If Alan had texted him last night, Peter might have been too weak to say no, but now he feels only revulsion at the thought of his ex's proposition. He has made up his inebriated mind. There will be no hooking up as far as Peter is concerned. He knows he shouldn't text back, but he's too angry to help himself. Sure, the alcohol might be fueling his rage, but hell, it feels good to give in to his feelings. And at least he isn't crying in a locker room full of shriveled old man dicks this time. He taps furiously away at the keys. You ripped my heart out. I hope the same happens to you. Just as soon as he pushes send, the bartender returns with his credit card. Peter signs the bill, tips him generously, and snags his phone off the bar. His blood returns to lukewarm, and a sense of pride is now rushing through him. He is glad he didn't allow himself to be taken advantage of, but he worries he might one day fall back into his ex's arms during a moment of weakness. Better to nip it in the bud and block Alan from contacting him so the situation doesn't get the chance to arise. He opens the chat back up and is about to block Alan's number when the picture that had been sent to him finally loads on his phone. Peter's blood is changing temperature again, but it isn't getting hot this time. Now it's starting to feel as if antifreeze has been injected into his veins. A silent terror falls upon him as he stares breathlessly into the picture. It isn't the fact that Alan is lying suggestively on his couch wearing nothing but a pair of tight red briefs that has made Peter's blood run cold. It isn't his icy blue stare or his chiseled physique either. In fact, there is nothing about Alan in the picture that Peter finds unsettling at all. It's what's perched behind Alan in the picture that is sending shivers through his body. A small, plushy elf that looks exactly like the one Peter threw in the ocean is sitting on his ex-boyfriend's throw pillow. Maybe it isn't his elf, he thinks. Maybe Alan has picked one up for himself at some point. It's Christmas Eve, after all, and those things pop up at retail stores across the country like a rash of holiday herpes sores every December. His elf should still be sitting at the bottom of the Pacific right now. There's no way it could have somehow gotten to Alan's place from there. Peter looks more carefully at the picture this time and sees that there's something beside the elf that is draped over the back of the couch, something snake-like and greenish-brown in colour. He places his index finger and thumb on the image, then expands it in order to get a closer look, and after he does this, he has to put his hand over his mouth in order to stifle a scream. It's seaweed. It has been Christmas morning for 17 minutes by the time Peter pulls up to his ex-boyfriend's house. Alan's BMW is parked in the driveway and the lights are on in his home. From the street, nothing looks amiss, but Peter has a terrible feeling that something wicked might be happening inside that house at this very moment. From the second he first saw the elf on his kitchen counter, he has been trying to convince himself that depression and loneliness had been fueling his paranoia, but now he's not so sure. The fact that Alan hasn't picked up a single call or answered any of his texts has only intensified his unease. He sinks low in his seat and peers out of his car, hoping to catch a glimpse of his ex through the window of his house. Any sign that would indicate that he's all right could put Peter's mind at rest. He can figure out how to cope with delusional fantasies, but he doesn't think he'd be able to handle it if what he fears is actually true. Peter buries his head in his hands until the world stops spinning. Why doesn't he just call an Uber and go home? Why should he care if Alan is in trouble? The guy's a jerk anyway. He asks himself these questions and others in a desperate attempt to excuse himself from the situation, but deep down he knows why he's there. It's the reason why he so recklessly risked a DUI or worse when he got inside his car and drove out to the valley as fast as he could when he saw that picture. Even though he hates Alan for dumping him, even though he has been attempting all day to drown his feelings for him in whiskey and seawater, a part of him still loves the man, and he doesn't think he could forgive himself if he let anything happen to him. He gets tired of waiting and steps out of his car on wobbly legs. The alcohol has hit him harder since he left the bar, and if he didn't have so much adrenaline pumping through him during the drive over, he probably would have passed out at the wheel. His body swerves to and fro across the cobblestone path leading up to the house, and by the time he gets to the door, his stomach begins to lurch. He keels over and gets ready to heave in the bushes, but the only thing that comes out is a deep, bellowing burp, and he's suddenly reminded of the clam chowder he had for lunch. Peter straightens himself out, then takes a deep breath and rings the doorbell. He sends a little prayer into the air that Alan will answer the door and everything will be all right. Maybe, if Peter's lucky, he'll even offer him a couch to crash on so he doesn't need to catch a ride home. But lots of prayers go out on Christmas, and God just doesn't have the time to answer them all. Peter's request seems to have landed in the Divine Backlog file, because after a few minutes of swaying back and forth on the front doorstep, it becomes evident that Alan isn't coming. He tries the doorknob. It's locked, but Peter knows there's a key in a fake rock hiding somewhere in the bushes, and it doesn't take long before he's able to locate it and let himself in. He is leaning up against the wall in Alan's foyer now. It feels weird to be back. When they were together, this place had felt like a second home, hell, maybe even a first one. He had spent more time at his boyfriend's place than his since they started dating. Now he can't help but feel like an intruder. Everything is still the way he remembers it. The same pictures hang from the walls, the same glass chandelier is still suspended from the ceiling, but the sense of welcoming and homeliness is gone, and it stings a little. The house isn't very big, a typical one-story Burbank bungalow on a tiny little lot in the middle of a residential neighborhood. The living room, where Alan sent the pic from, is just through a door on the other side of the foyer. The house is well lit, but aside from that, there doesn't seem to be any sign of life. There's no music, and it doesn't sound like anyone is watching TV in the living room. Peter calls out Alan's name, but no one answers. He calls out again, this time loud enough for his voice to carry through every room, but again is met with only silence. Peter crosses the foyer and almost falls flat on his face before catching himself against the wall on the other side of the room. He keels over, fights off the urge to puke again, then forgets all about his nausea when he catches a glimpse of the living room. The scene looks almost like a picture you'd see on the cover of the holiday issue of some trendy interior design magazine. The walls are painted a lilac grey, which gives the room a fashionable yet cosy ambiance, and in front of the black leather couch sits a modern coffee table that had cost Alan a mint. A beautiful Christmas tree draped with gold ribbons and expensive crystal ornaments stands tall in the corner next to a floor-to-ceiling window that looks out to the backyard, and the fire crackling in the fireplace really helps to hammer home the Christmas-time motif. There is only one thing out of place, but it would easily disqualify the room from receiving a feature in Country Living or Better Homes and Gardens, or any of the other home design magazines that Peter reads when he's on the toilet. Just beneath the fireplace, sprawled out across the floor, face up in a deep red pool of blood, is Alan's corpse. Either Peter blacked out after seeing Alan's body, or time skipped a beat, because the next thing he knows he's on the other side of the room, bawling his eyes out and cradling his ex-lover's head in his lap. He is sitting in the scarlet puddle now, and there is no way the stains are going to come out of his favourite jeans in the wash, but Peter doesn't care. What's a little blood compared to what Alan has gone through? His former lover has been horribly maimed, his chest split in two and pried apart with the fireplace tools scattered across the floor. From the look of abject horror on Alan's face, he was alive as his body was being torn apart. Ribs have been broken, and his internal organs are visible through the massive, gaping cavity that was once a chest. Well, not all of his internal organs. Peter wipes the tears from his eyes, smearing blood across his face, and sees that something is missing. He glances up to the couch and sees the elf staring at him from the throw pillow, still as silent and statuesque as ever, still grinning its horrible little grin. Something appears to be resting in its lap. It's about the size of a fist, and as red as the hat on Kris Kringle's head. He remembers the text he sent from the bar earlier that night. "You ripped out my heart. I hope the same happens to you." "I didn't ask for this!" he screams. Peter grabs the fireplace shovel, one of the instruments that had been used to open up Alan's chest, and shoots to his feet. He storms across the room, all the while hurling enough curse words at the elf to land himself on Santa's naughty list for the next 10 years. Once he's a few feet away from it, he grits his teeth and raises the shovel over his head. "You did this! Why couldn't you just leave me alone?" Peter brings the shovel down as hard as he can. For sure, he thinks this will be the moment where the elf springs to life before his eyes, just in time to dodge the blow and dance around the room, laughing like the maniacal little demon it truly is. Or maybe it will snatch the shovel away at the last second and use it on him like a can opener the same way it did Alan. Whatever it does, now is the time it shows its hand, right? Now's the time the little bastard proves it's more supernatural hellspawn than superstore novelty knickknack. But the elf doesn't move. It just smiles and takes its beating, and even after the shovel collides with its plushy little body for the 27th time and stuffing is popping through its seams, the elf doesn't even bother to blink an eye. Peter drops the shovel and looks at his work. Some of the plastic beads that make up the elf's beanbag body have scattered onto the floor, and one of its arms is dangling precariously by a thread. Alan's heart, which had been sitting on the elf's lap, had become an unfortunate bystander during Peter's onslaught and is now mushed across the couch's cushions. Peter had given the elf everything he had during his moment of rage. That many blows from the heavy iron shovel would have been enough to shatter a human's skull into nothing but paste. Yet somehow, as he stares at what he's done, he feels like his work is unfinished. He snatches the elf off the couch and squeezes it in his hand so hard his veins begin bulging in his forearms. He isn't done with it yet. If he leaves, the son of a bitch will just come back. It will follow him until his dying days, he's sure of it. His eyes trail over to Alan's corpse on the floor. It looks as if a xenomorph had been nesting inside his chest. In the stone hearth behind him, the fire is still burning strong, and Peter now knows what he's going to do. He races across the room, rears his arm back, and hurls his Christmas-time pal into the flames. The elf does not scream as the fire engulfs it. It does not curse him in a demonic voice or flail in agony. It doesn't do anything, really, other than blacken and burn and warp into a misshapen mass. But Peter finds satisfaction in this anyway. Come back from that, he thinks to himself. The world begins to spin around him again, so he sits down on the couch and sucks in a deep breath. In all the excitement, he had forgotten he was pissed drunk, but before he has a chance to stand up again, a voice fills the room.
Hello, sir?
For a second, he thinks it might be the elf, but when he looks back to the fireplace, he sees what's left of it still swaddled in the flames. No, it can't be the elf. This voice is too masculine and tinny, and it sounds like it's coming from inside the couch.
Sir, are you still there?
He roots around in the seat cushions for a few seconds before he finds the source. Alan's phone had been buried beneath the couch's pillows, and it appears to be in the middle of a call. Peter holds the phone to his ear, but doesn't respond.
Sir, if you can't talk, just remain calm. We've already dispatched the police. They should be arriving at your house shortly.
His mind starts to race as he takes in his surroundings. He looks at the beautiful Christmas tree and the modern coffee table and the body of his former lover lying mutilated on the living room floor. In the reflection of the window, he sees himself. His clothes are filthy. His shirt more stained and bloody than John McClane's at the end of Die Hard. How is he supposed to explain this to the police? His clothes are covered in Alan's DNA, and the real murderer is burning up in the fireplace. Does he have time to make a run for it? On the way over, he had promised himself he'd never drive drunk again, but in this case he might make an exception. He doesn't get the chance to break that promise, though, because by the time he gets to the front door, 2 squad cars are already parked in the driveway. Their blue and red lights pulsate in the darkness like a rave scene. When the cops step out of their vehicles and shine their flashlights on him, Peter drops to his knees in the doorway. "It wasn't me!" he screams. "It was the elf! It was the goddamn elf, I swear!" It is early Christmas morning, 1 year after Peter was arrested for the murder of his ex-boyfriend, Alan. Dawn hasn't broken yet, and the sky is still slate black. Peter is lying in bed and gazing into the darkness through the single window of his cell. He is closing out the first of what is to be a 40-year prison sentence. The guilty verdict wasn't a difficult decision for the jury to make, not after all the evidence that had been presented in court. The murder weapon had Peter's fingerprints all over it. Peter had the victim's blood all over him. And of course there was the little matter of that threatening text message which basically served a confession to the crime. You ripped out my heart. I hope the same happens to you. Open and shut case. Peter's family never bothered to come to the trial. They might have believed the murder was the result of some sort of satanic homosexual practice Peter had picked up from a Hollywood sadist cult. Even after his arrest, they didn't bother to pick up any of his calls, but he is okay with that now. In fact, he hasn't tried phoning them in months, and he thinks he's found peace with the fact that he'll never hear from them again. He's found peace with a lot of things as of late. His prison psychiatrist had been helping him get over the underlying issues that had been plaguing him just 1 year ago. He doesn't wallow in his loneliness anymore. He has his own cell, and the solitude doesn't even bother him. Now he welcomes the peace it comes with. He has gotten into reading, and he has a little book of Sudoku that keeps his thoughts occupied when he doesn't want to dive into a world of fantasy. He's still working with his psychiatrist to get over his feelings about the elf, though. She has been trying to help him realize that what he experienced last Christmas wasn't real. A stress-induced hallucination is what she describes the episode as. Whenever she tells him this, Peter nods and smiles and agrees with whatever she says, and maybe even a part of him would like to believe that she is right. But somewhere deep down he feels like that's not the case. There's no way he could be a murderer. He isn't capable of harming a fly, even, and Alan was the last person on Earth he would wish harm on. But a year has passed, and the elf is still just a memory, so maybe he thinks that she is onto something. Maybe the fire did away with the little bastard, or maybe it's the antipsychotic medications. Either way, it doesn't matter. He just has to work on being happy with what he's got. At least the guards aren't jerks to him, and none of the inmates have tried to mess with him yet. He even heard whispers that he's developed a reputation around the prison after word got out about the nature of his crime. He chuckles to himself. Big bad Peter, toughest guy in the yard. The bit of pressure that had been building in Peter's bladder has started to get uncomfortable, so he figures he might as well start Christmas off with a good morning piss. He swings his feet over the edge of the bed, sits up, then rubs the sleep from his eyes. One of the best parts about having his own cell is not having to share a toilet with anyone. He looks over to the chrome commode in the corner of his cell, and it's here that he sees it, sitting on the edge of the rim, black, charred, twisted and deformed, but still grinning its wicked grin and staring at him through a pair of melty blue eyes. Peter screams so loud it wakes every inmate in the cell block. He fights the guards when they arrive, and it takes 4 grown men to hold him down long enough to inject him with a sedative. One final, horrifying thought lights up his synapses just before his muscles go slack and his vision fades to black. The elf is back.
Follow us, if you dare, for stories, exclusives, merchandise, and more at grimharvestpodcast.com. All stories heard on this podcast are produced under license. No portion of this content can be rebroadcast or distributed without the express prior written consent of the story's author. To obtain license and permissions, please contact us at admin@grimharvestpodcast.com.